They made you believe your life is bound by fixed laws, that nothing can change without years of struggle or impossible luck. But the truth, hidden in restricted circles and mocked by the media, is that there's a mechanism capable of rewriting not only your future, but also your past. A silent code the spiritual elite has mastered for centuries, shifting your inner frequency until the world around you is forced to reorganize. While the masses remain trapped in cycles of scarcity and fear, a few already live in realities where time and space bend to their will. And here's the shock. You already tap into these states without realizing it, but you've been trained to ignore them. Every thought you hold is an invisible command to the universe, and it obeys. The question is, will you keep reflecting the programming they planted in you, or will you take control and step into the dimension that has always been yours by right before they erase this knowledge forever?
The visible world is not solid, it is malleable, unstable, and responds with precision to what is sustained in consciousness. This statement is not a poetic metaphor, but an observation that deconstructs the materialist foundation upon which much of civilization rests. Everything that is perceived as physical reality is, in truth, a reflection of the vibrational frequency that is maintained within. This is not about motivational belief, but about an invisible architecture in which every event, every coincidence, and every detail is shaped by internal states of consciousness. What keeps most people imprisoned in the same scenario, repeating problems and patterns, is not the force of external circumstances, but the inability to recognize that these circumstances are effects, not causes. As long as one believes that the world is independent of the mind, profound change remains out of reach. This is why speaking of changing dimensions is not limited to science fiction or obscure mysticism. It is about understanding that a dimension is a state of consciousness, and that transitioning between dimensions means radically altering the way one perceives, interprets, and sustains reality. This transition does not happen by accident. It requires a shock of perception, the understanding that everything has already been created, and that the only variable that defines what is experienced is the vibrational frequency of consciousness itself. Here, frequency is not just an analogy. It is the language through which mind and matter correspond. Just as a radio station can only transmit what it is tuned to receive, the individual only experiences experiences that correspond to the internal state they maintain. Behind the scenes of this reality, subtle laws govern the process: the law of assumption, the Hermetic principle of mentalism, and retrocausality. Together, they reveal that past, present, and future are not fixed lines, but simultaneous layers that reconfigure themselves as consciousness shifts. Quantum physics, with the double-slit phenomenon, has already exposed a glimpse of this. Matter has no defined form until it is observed, and this observation or expectation shapes the outcome. This connection between science and spirituality is not accidental. For centuries, esoteric traditions have preserved, under symbolic language, the same truth that modern experiments are beginning to indicate: the universe is mental, and consciousness is the only substance from which everything is made. Understanding this shifts the individual's role from victim of circumstances to conscious creator of their experience. However, this revelation has implications that few are willing to accept. If reality is shaped by the internal state, then every event, no matter how external it seems, was somehow selected by consciousness itself. This includes what is interpreted as unfair, painful, or accidental. Here begins the discomfort. Assuming that nothing is completely random also means assuming that the power to rewrite any aspect of life is in one's own hands, or more precisely, in one's own mind. What is at stake, therefore, is not just manifesting something desired, but transcending the dualistic paradigm that separates light and darkness, good and evil, possible and impossible. This is the breaking point where the deepest layers of consciousness begin to reveal an expanded reality, where the boundaries between present and future dissolve and the past ceases to be an immutable archive. The goal here is to reveal, progressively, how this invisible structure operates and how it can be consciously used to access higher dimensions. Throughout this video, seemingly abstract concepts will be exposed in clear and practical terms without diluting their depth. The question is not if this dimensional shift is possible, but whether the listener is willing to abandon the safety of the dominant narrative and take the risk of taking responsibility for their own universe. This is our starting point, understanding that reality is not found, it is chosen, and that choosing another reality begins inevitably by altering one's own state of being. From here, everything that was believed to be solid will begin to reveal its true state, a reversible and moldable projection of consciousness. To understand how it is possible to change dimensions, it is necessary to dismantle the most ingrained premise of modern thought, that reality is, in essence, material. Materialism, as the dominant doctrine, maintains that consciousness arises as a byproduct of matter, a side effect of biochemical processes in the brain. Within this view, the mind is a prisoner of the body, and the body, in turn, is limited by the fixed laws of classical physics. Within this closed paradigm, the idea of shaping reality through consciousness sounds impossible. But this conceptual structure begins to show cracks when confronted with phenomena that do not fit the materialist model. The first rupture comes from quantum physics. Experiments like the double-slit experiment, repeated, validated, and documented over the last century, demonstrate that subatomic particles do not present a defined state until they are measured. The act of measurement, which here means interaction with an observer or instrument, not only reveals the result, but actively participates in its determination. This inflection point brings modern science closer to an ancient principle already recorded in Hermeticism, mentalism. The Hermetic principle of mentalism, present in the teachings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, declares, "The all is mind, the universe is mental." Far from being a spiritual metaphor, this statement describes that everything that is perceived, objects, events, relationships, and even the sensation of time, is a manifestation of a single substance, consciousness. There is no out there, independent of the observer. The so-called world is a projection and direct reflection of the internal state of the one who observes. This reflection is filtered and shaped by something that can be described as a signature of light, a unique vibrational pattern specific to each individual. This signature is not limited to visible light or to any band measurable by conventional sensors. It is a direct expression of the set of beliefs, expectations, and interpretations sustained within. At the center of this structure is the I Am, the pure consciousness of being, which remains constant regardless of external variations. The I Am is not the personality, the physical body, or the accumulated biography. It is the neutral base upon which all these arrangements form. Around this core, temporary configurations arise. I am healthy, I am weak, I am respected, I am ignored. These definitions shape the vibrational frequency emitted, and it is this frequency that the universe returns in the form of experience. The world, in this sense, acts as an absolutely impartial mirror. It does not reflect superficial desires, but rather deep and dominant convictions. Altering this reflection necessarily implies changing the signature of light, and this only happens when there is a genuine change in the concept sustained about oneself. Here, it is necessary to correct a common misconception. Dimension does not mean a physical place. distant or hidden by spatial barriers. Dimension is a state of consciousness. Changing dimensions is changing the vibrational frequency and, with it, accessing a different configuration of reality, not through physical displacement, but through tuning, like changing stations on a radio. This tuning adjustment does not affect only future events. The phenomenon known as retrocausality, debated by physicists since the mid-20th century in proposals such as the Wheeler-Feynman absorber theory or John Kramer's transactional interpretation, suggests that changes in the present can influence what is perceived as the past. Retrocausality, therefore, is not a new concept. What is renewed is the scientific interest in exploring it experimentally. When the frequency of consciousness is altered, not only does what is to come reorganize itself, but also the memory and the record of what already happened can present variations. This understanding also dismantles the illusion of linear time. The Hermetic tradition and various esoteric currents have maintained for millennia that everything exists simultaneously, and that what we call past and future are just perceptual cutouts within a larger field of possibilities. Altering the state of consciousness is equivalent to repositioning oneself in this field, accessing different sequences of events without it being necessary to travel anywhere. The impact of this understanding is radical. The individual ceases to be an inevitable product of circumstances and becomes the principal agent of their own experience. This is not an invitation to escapism or to denial of facts, but to the assumption of responsibility at its highest degree. If reality is mental and reflective, then every detail of the experience, both the celebrated and the unwanted, was, in some way, selected by consciousness itself. The practical implication is direct. There is no lasting transformation that can occur only through the manipulation of external elements. It is the alteration of the concept of oneself that reconfigures the vibrational signature. Once the signature is altered, reality has no choice but to reflect the new configuration. This is the conceptual foundation necessary before advancing to the core of the matter, the mechanism by which one accesses and stabilizes a higher state of consciousness, the true dimensional shift. Without this foundation, any discussion about higher dimensions dilutes into abstractions. With it, each principle and technique takes on an operational and measurable meaning. The central point of all this reasoning is not metaphysical speculation about alternative realities, but the operational understanding of how consciousness transits between states, and, with it, between dimensions. At the heart of this process is the principle of the I am, not as an affirmative phrase, but as the naked consciousness of existing. This perception, simple in appearance, is the key to accessing higher levels of experience. The I am is the fixed point around which everything else orbits. It does not depend on the body, on personal history, or on any attribute that can be added or removed. It is prior to any concept of identity. It is the same I that, in childhood, observed the world, and that decades later continues observing, although the scenarios and roles have changed. This continuity indicates that the core of the one who perceives is not affected by transitory forms. The higher dimension is not a distant place to be reached, but a state of consciousness that already exists, waiting to be assumed. It is at this point that the practice of controlled imagination and sustained attention on the feeling of the wish fulfilled becomes the central tool. Imagination, in this context, is not fantasy or escape. It is the mechanism for selecting realities. What is imagined with clarity and sustained with persistence does not remain as an isolated internal image. It alters the vibrational field and, consequently, the configuration of perceived reality. The so-called law of assumption formulates this in a direct way. Any state assumed with conviction and maintained as dominant inevitably becomes fact. This law does not distinguish between true or false, just or unjust. It reflects with exactness the state of consciousness that is maintained as inner reality. This means that by assuming the feeling of already being or already having what is desired, one is not creating something new in the absolute sense, but shifting consciousness to a point where that already exists. This shift is subtle. It does not involve physical effort or the direct manipulation of external circumstances. The work is internal. It consists of stabilizing the sensation that the desired state is already the current state. This stabilization requires more than a mechanically repeated affirmation. It requires a sensory and emotional immersion in the chosen scenario until it becomes natural. When the new state ceases to seem like a hypothesis and becomes the internal reference, the dimensional transition has already occurred at the level of consciousness, and the external world, as a reflection, begins to reorganize itself. The most common mistake when trying to apply this principle is to simultaneously maintain two conflicting states, desiring something while remaining emotionally rooted in the opposite. This is like trying to listen to a radio station without leaving the previous one. The result is noise. Effective change only happens when one completely abandons the previous state and mentally occupies the new one without reservations. Another crucial point is to understand that imagination is not just visual. It is multisensory. Feeling, hearing, seeing, even smelling and touching the desired scenario in imagination strengthens the vibrational coherence. This is the code that the universe mirrors. The more consistent and free of contradictions this internal code is, the faster and more precise the corresponding manifestation will be. What differentiates this process from simple positive visualization is permanence. It is not about creating a mental image for a few minutes and then returning to the habitual state, but about mentally living in the new state continuously. This demands discipline of attention because the mind tends to be dragged back to old perceptual habits. It is at this point that deliberate practice, repeatedly returning to the assumed state, becomes the difference between an ephemeral experience and a stable dimensional shift. It is worth noting that this change of state does not occur in a vacuum. It alters not only what is experienced in the future, but also the relationship with what is considered the past. When assuming a new state of consciousness, memories can reorganize themselves to align with it. Events that once seemed insurmountable obstacles can come to be seen as necessary pieces that sustained the path to the new state. This reinterpretation is not a psychological trick to feel better. It is the natural consequence of the dimensional perspective shift. The dimensional shift through consciousness is, therefore, simultaneously an act of creation and of recognition. Creation, because a new vibrational arrangement is established. Recognition, because this arrangement already existed as a possibility in the infinite field of realities. Consciousness does not invent anything from scratch. It selects and occupies. The practical implication is direct and inescapable. There is no authentic transformation without an internal change of state. As long as the central identity remains tied to a specific set of beliefs and perceptions, reality will continue to reflect it with absolute fidelity. Altering the internal narrative, in the sense of replacing the I that one believes oneself to be, is not an exercise in idle imagination. It is the very mechanics of dimensional transition. This is the essence of the conceptual core. Access to higher dimensions does not require physical displacement, nor does it depend on external circumstances. It requires only, and exactly, an internal decision to inhabit a new state of consciousness until it becomes the only recognized reality. Once this stability is achieved, there is no external force capable of preventing the reflection in the world from adjusting to the new pattern. It is with this understanding that one can advance to the observation of the concrete effects of this transition, tangible manifestations and phenomena that challenge the linearity of time and the supposed fixity of the past, revealing that the dimensional shift is more than theory. It is an observable process. When one understands that dimension is a state of consciousness and that its alteration reorganizes the reflection of reality, certain phenomena become more than curiosities or coincidences. They become evidence that the dimensional transition is underway. Among these signs, two stand out for the clarity with which they demonstrate the mental nature of reality: the relationship between light and darkness as states of consciousness and the so-called Mandela Effect. The understanding of light and darkness in this context is not limited to physics or theology. Darkness is not the absolute absence of light, it is a different state of the same substance. Just as a pixel on a screen can be on or off, each point of experience is a pixel of consciousness. What appears in the material world is simply the set of pixels lit by attention. What does not receive attention continues to exist as a possibility, but remains off, invisible to the observer. The change of state of consciousness is, therefore, the act of turning on new pixels and turning off others. This explains why certain circumstances, people, or information seem to appear out of nowhere when someone changes their internal focus. It is not that these things did not exist before, they were in the unlit area of perception. What is called discovery is just the light of attention revealing what was already there, waiting to be noticed. This logic also explains why certain experiences disappear when one changes dimensions. If a state of consciousness no longer sustains a specific set of pixels, they turn off from the external reflection. This is why, when altering the vibrational frequency, the world around not only transforms but also loses elements that were once constant. The disappearance of certain patterns, people, or events is not accidental loss. It is the mirror adjusting to the new internal configuration. The Mandela Effect is a specific and collective case of this phenomenon. It occurs when a significant group of people remembers, with conviction, a detail, event, or piece of information differently from what is currently recorded. The name comes from the most famous example: millions of people remembering Nelson Mandela's death in the 1980s, when, according to records, he died decades later. The superficial analysis labels this phenomenon as collective memory failure, but this explanation ignores the fact that these memories are often precise in specific details that would have no reason to be identically invented by so many people. Retrocausality offers an alternative. When collective or individual consciousness shifts to another dimension, the historical record corresponding to this new frequency may differ from what was previously experienced. These alterations are not limited to major political events. They can occur on a personal and subtle scale. A passage from a sacred book that previously contained certain words now appears with another formulation. An ancient symbol displays an additional stroke that was not in memory. A place visited in the past has a different physical arrangement. When the frequency changes, the file of reality adjusts, and the perceived past reconfigures to align with the new state. This phenomenon is more easily identified when there is contrast with intense memories. It is common for remarkable spiritual experiences, a deep meditation, a revealing insight, a moment of overcoming, to be revisited later, and present details that were not there before, or that were there and disappeared. What seems like memory instability is actually instability of the dimensional field in which consciousness is operating. It is important to understand that this turning off and turning on of pixels does not occur only at the perceptual level, but also at the causal level. When changing dimensions, one is not just altering how events are remembered, but also reconfiguring the chains of cause and effect that sustain them. This is what makes retrocausality so disturbing for those trapped in the concept of linear time. A past event can have a completely different unfolding as a function of a current change in state of consciousness. This mechanism explains why profound changes in perspective not only transform the future, but, retrospectively, change the meaning and even the facts associated with the past. It is as if the entire narrative of life were edited to fit the new frequency. This editing is not symbolic, but literal. New details are inserted, old ones are removed, and even the sequence of events can be altered. At the collective level, this process is even more complex. Consciousnesses that share a similar vibrational band mutually reinforce the reflection of this reality. When a critical mass of individuals changes frequency, the collective reflection adjusts, and what was consensus can become controversial, or vice versa. It is at this point that phenomena like the Mandela Effect acquire a social dimension. They are not just curiosities, but indicators of collective changes in states of consciousness. As intriguing as it is, this understanding does not serve only to fuel theoretical debates. It is the key to understanding how to stabilize the dimensional transition. Recognizing that external reality is a mirror, and that the mirror is sensitive to the slightest internal alteration, makes inevitable the conclusion that focus and the quality of attention are the most valuable variables one can control. If each pixel of experience responds to the state of consciousness, then the deliberate choice of what to illuminate is what defines the inhabited dimension. Most people illuminate, without realizing it, what they wish to avoid, reinforcing it. But the one who understands this mechanism can select, with precision, which aspects of reality should be kept active and which should be left in darkness. This selection is not made through denial, but through substitution. Attention, like a beam of light, must be redirected to the desired state until the previous one turns off for lack of energy. It is in this process that the dimensional shift ceases to be a sporadic phenomenon and becomes a conscious ability, capable of producing consistent results. Understanding the logic of consciousness pixels, the role of attention as light, and retrocausal manifestations not only validates the theory, but also provides the tools to apply it. If external reality is no longer seen as a fixed scenario, but as a mutable reflection of the state of consciousness, the consequences spread through all levels of life. The simple act of understanding that each circumstance, favorable or adverse, is the result of one's own vibrational signature already shifts the position from passive observer to active architect of experience. This requires a rare type of honesty, admitting that what one rejects is also attracted and sustained by one's own focus. At this point, dualistic judgment reveals itself as a structural obstacle. Judging something as bad does not dissipate it. On the contrary, it fixes it in perception by involving emotional attention. The energy expended in resistance is, in practice, fuel to keep the unwanted configuration alive. This is why older spiritual traditions insisted on the principle of not resisting evil, not as resignation, but as deliberate withdrawal of attention. The transcendence of judgment does not mean ignoring or justifying destructive behaviors. It means refusing to internally perpetuate the frequency that sustains such manifestations. When attention is shifted to what one wants to experience, the unwanted structure ceases to receive enough energy to remain active. This reorientation is less a moral act and more a technical adjustment in the mechanism of creation. Unconditional love, in this context, is not romantic emotion or passive benevolence. It is the highest possible vibration of coherence between the I am and the external reflection. It arises when there is no conflict between the internal state and the circumstances experienced. Instead of reacting to each event as if it were an independent force, one recognizes that it is part of a larger field of choices already made, conscious or not. This view also redefines the relationship with what is called error or failure. When looking retrospectively from a higher frequency, episodes that were previously interpreted as obstacles come to be understood as indispensable steps for the current configuration. The dimensional shift recontextualizes the past, dissolving the victim narrative and replacing it with that of the author. One no longer asks, "Why did this happen to me?" but "Why did I select this experience?" And the answer, when it comes, is always integrative. The practical application of this understanding can seem challenging precisely because it contradicts the usual logic of confrontation and control. In the traditional approach, one seeks to manipulate the physical world directly, correcting people, altering circumstances, eliminating unwanted conditions. Here, the manipulation is internal, altering the state of consciousness until the external reflection, inevitably, adjusts. This is the territory where persistence becomes the decisive factor. Maintaining the feeling of the wish fulfilled, not as future expectation, but as an already established condition, requires consistency even in the face of contrary evidence in the physical world. It is this fidelity to the new state that hardens it into reality, to use Neville Goddard's term. The oscillation between states interrupts the formation of a stable reflection, resulting in fragmented experiences. When this internal discipline stabilizes, external changes begin to occur almost organically. People, opportunities, and circumstances that were once invisible emerge without apparent effort. At the same time, situations that no longer align with the new state disappear or dissolve on their own. It is the same logic observed in pixel erasure phenomena, but now applied intentionally. The philosophical implications are equally profound. If every experience is the result of an internal state, concepts like luck and destiny lose explanatory weight. The narrative that events occur by chance or by an arbitrary external force gives way to the understanding that everything is the result of vibrational coherence or incoherence. What is called a miracle is not a breaking of natural laws, but a sudden alignment between the internal state and a highly desired outcome. This paradigm shift is not without discomfort. By assuming total responsibility for one's own experience, the possibility of blaming chance, others, or the system disappears. For some, this perception is liberating, for others, unbearable. But it is precisely this point that separates superficial understanding from real application. As long as there is a willingness to outsource the authorship of one's own reality, the dimensional shift will remain partial and unstable. On the collective plane, the application of this knowledge could reconfigure the way entire societies operate. Structures based on fear and scarcity only maintain themselves because large groups vibrate in tune with these frequencies. From the moment a sufficient number of individuals sustain higher states of consciousness, institutions and systems that do not resonate with these frequencies begin to naturally dismantle. This transition, although it may seem chaotic on the surface, is just the reflection of a collective field reorganizing itself. At the individual level, the inevitable question is, how to maintain this elevated frequency consistently? The answer, although simple, is relentless, choosing, moment by moment, where to place attention and with what quality. It is not about thinking positive, a superficial concept that ignores the vibrational depth of beliefs, but about cultivating an internal coherence so stable that nothing external can dislodge it. This is the point where technique meets life philosophy. What begins as deliberate practice, assuming the desired state and sustaining it, transforms into a natural way of operating in the world. The initial effort gives way to a continuous flow in which consciousness moves fluidly between layers of reality, selecting experiences so spontaneously that the very idea of technique dissolves. With the understanding and application of this principle, the dimensional transition ceases to be a rare event and becomes the default mode of existing. The external reflection, once seen as something to be conquered or fought, becomes just the inevitable accompaniment of a carefully maintained internal state. And it is at this point that the need arises to synthesize all this knowledge into a final reflection, not just to conclude the analysis, but to provoke a conscious choice about which reality one wishes to inhabit from now on. Accepting that consciousness shapes reality is crossing a point of no return. After this understanding settles in, there is no way to see the world as before. Everything that presents itself, people, encounters, losses, gains, obstacles, and openings, is recognized as a direct expression of an internal state. This perception undoes the idea that one lives in a neutral, impersonal, and indifferent universe. On the contrary, it reveals that the universe responds with mathematical precision to the vibrational signature emitted at each moment. If every fragment of experience is a consequence of an internal state, what exactly is being sustained now? This question is not rhetorical. It functions as a diagnostic key. It allows one to detect the dominant frequency before it crystallizes into events and circumstances. It is the mental equivalent of observing the direction of the wind before adjusting the sails. By integrating all the elements explored up to here, the unique signature of light, the mental nature of the universe, the relationship between light and darkness, retrocausality, the impact of focus, and the transcendence of judgment, it becomes impossible to ignore that the dimension in which one lives is not fixed. It is selected and maintained from within. The supposed solidity of reality is just the persistence of an unquestioned vibrational pattern. It is not a comfortable realization. It removes the shelter of chance and the externalization of responsibility. The mind trained to seek culprits or external explanations loses the ground where it once stood. For some, this loss is uncomfortable. For others, it is liberating. Everything depends on how much one is willing to assume total control over the field of consciousness one occupies. And there is still a less obvious implication. If consciousness can rewrite the external reflection, it also redefines the narrative of the past and the trajectory of the future. The linearity of time dissolves and gives way to a simultaneous field of possibilities, in which before and after are just angles of observation. This means that changing now is changing everything, not just what is to come, but also the meaning and even the facts of what has already been lived. In this scenario, insisting on inhabiting a state of consciousness misaligned with what is desired is deliberately choosing a dimension where what is wanted does not exist. This choice is silent and often unconscious, but its effects are inevitable. Recognizing this mechanism is like having in hand the map and the compass of a territory previously explored blindly. The final provocation is not about believing or not believing in this model, but about testing its validity in a practical way. It is impossible to deny direct results when the internal state is altered with consistency and the world responds proportionally. Doubt, at this point, ceases to be intellectual and becomes an operational obstacle. What is proposed, therefore, is a change of posture. No longer reacting to circumstances as if they were autonomous entities, but treating them as clues to the current state of consciousness. Every event is a mirror. The question is not, what does this mean about the world? But what does this reveal about the state I am inhabiting? This simple yet radical inversion alters the entire logic of interaction with reality. The moment this perception becomes stable, life ceases to be a flow of random events and reveals itself as an intelligible sequence of reflections. With each choice of focus, a specific set of possibilities lights up and another turns off. It is impossible not to create. The only variable is whether the creation is deliberate or automatic. The conscious transition to higher dimensions requires, then, more than theoretical understanding. It requires practice. Not mechanical or ritualized practice, but a living discipline of adjusting the internal frequency until it corresponds to the scenario one wishes to experience. This is not a one-time act, but a way of operating, a new pattern of functioning. Responsibility is proportional to power. If everything responds to the state of consciousness, staying in tune with the chosen frequency is not optional. It is the very core of the process. To ignore this is to abdicate the role of co-creator and hand over the helm to inertia. Every change begins with understanding your role as a co-creator, and the only way to connect with this divine intelligence is through meditation. We have developed a set of audio tools to help you access this higher state of consciousness. To learn more and get immediate access, click on the link on the screen or in the comments. If this video resonated with you, write in the comments, "It made sense to me,"